In this video, we're going to introduce the Western Connecticut State University lesson plan template. Now, there are, of course, many lesson plan templates that exist out there, and they all serve their own purpose. But the one we've adopted here is to help you write your EdTPA, which is a performance assessment you'll complete during student teaching. So there are some portions of this template that you wouldn't see in, say, a regular lesson plan template for when you go out into the school districts. But regardless, it's one that you're going to need to practice so that by the time you get to student teaching, you're ready to complete that EdTPA. Okay, so the top of this lesson plan template is pretty straightforward. Obviously, you put your name, the grade level or levels that the lesson plan is for, the date you're teaching it, the course / the subject, the lesson title, and if you are submitting a lesson plan as part of a sequence of lesson plans, so like in a sample EdTPA or in your actual EdTPA, so you have some number sequence here, you would list the lesson number. So for example, for the EdTPA, you have to submit 3 to 5 lesson plans, and so you would have to label it as lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, lesson 4, lesson 5, etc. And that is a requirement of the EdTPA. So if you're just submitting a single lesson plan as part of a course, then of course you can just leave that part out. But the number should be included if you're doing your capstone or an actual EdTPA. And then the length of time the course runs. So obviously if it's like a 70-minute block or whatever, we want to know that. Okay, so moving on to the central focus. So what you'll notice about this lesson plan template right away is we have some comments over here. So, and this is meant to be to help you write the lesson plan, to fill it out. When you're done and you're ready to submit your lesson plan, you should delete all of these comments so they're not included or printed when you submit it. And I'll talk to you about how to do that at the end of this video. So the central focus is something that you should view the definition of in the EdTPA handbook. So we can see here, according to the handbook, the central focus is a description of the important understandings and core concepts that you want students to develop within the learning segment. The central focus should go beyond a list of facts and procedures. It should align with content standards and learning objectives and address the subject-specific components in the learning segment. For example, the subject-specific components for secondary mathematics are conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and math reasoning and/or problem-solving skills. A central focus for the learning segment might be relations between symbolic expressions and graphs of lines. The learning segment would focus on conceptual understanding of linear functions, slope, and intercepts, and the associated procedures and mathematical reasoning and/or problem-solving skills. Okay, so this definition is pulled from the Secondary Education Math Handbook. And so obviously if you are in a different content area, you should look up at the very end, there's the list of definitions. You should look up the central focus for your subject area and look for the example that they list there, and that might help you. So just to give you an example, this is a sample lesson plan that I'll be sort of showing you pieces of. This, again, a secondary mathematics example. But for this central focus, it would be logarithms and their relationship and use with exponential equations. So that was the way I phrased that central focus. Next up on the template, is to list the standards that are aligned to your lesson plan. So these would be using maybe the Common Core state standards or whatever applicable national standards there would be for your content area. And so just so you can see an example for the math ones, this was aligned to the Common Core state standards, and there's content standards, and for math there's also the math practice standards. So you would list all of these standards in this region right here. Next up is the learning goals or objectives. So if we just read the comment over here, so you want to identify 1 or 2 goals for each for students, and after each goal you want to state how you will communicate the goals to your students. Right? So it's not really worthwhile if you just say, I want the students to be able to do X, Y, or Z. You have to really think about how are you going to actually communicate that. So again, if you want to look at this sample that I made, and I'll explain this watermark in a little bit, but so here is an example of my objective. So students will evaluate or, when necessary, estimate common logarithm expressions without a calculator and verify the results on a calculator. So this is a very specific, measurable goal. The second one, students will discover that the domain of the common logarithm function is all positive real numbers and explain why this makes sense in terms of its definition. And then notice I say here that both of these objectives will be posted on the board at the beginning of class. So that's just one example of how you can communicate your objectives. Maybe you would alternatively, you would just have it listed at the top of a handout, or maybe it's something that you have a student come up and put on the board, or you have them read it off of a smartboard slide, or there's certainly many examples of how you can communicate that, but you do want to think about that as part of your lesson plan. Okay, next up in the template is a why statement. So this is a fairly, this is a newer addition to this template, but it really is important for you to be thinking about why would you be teaching what you're teaching. So as I said in the comment here, what is the lesson topic? Why is this lesson topic important? And so you want to consider connections to prior and future learning. Now that hint in there, the consider connections to prior future learning, this is part of the EdTPA, that you want to be able to justify why your topic is relevant. Why should you be teaching this topic? And how does it connect to what the students already know or what they will be learning? And again, you want to state how you're going to communicate the relevance to the lesson topic. So this should be a very, let's see, what's the right word for this? This should be a more common language sort of statement, something that's very accessible to all students. It shouldn't have too much depth in it in the sense of like needing lots of language in order to understand it. It should be really a statement that anyone could come into your classroom, read the why statement, and get a sense of the relevance of the topic. So just to give you an example, in this one, solving for the variable in an exponential equation using trial and error isn't efficient or precise without logarithms, right? So the whole point of this lesson will be to talk about how you solve an exponential equation using logarithms. And so why would you want to do this? Well, because trial and error is just not very efficient. And so that really just gets at the heart to help students see why we would want to learn this. Here's a second lesson, and I just wanted to give you another example. This lesson would be on logarithm properties. So a why statement for this one would be that logarithm properties allow us to evaluate logarithms of any base on our calculator, which allows us to solve for exponential equations of any positive base. And then there's a connection to future learning here by me mentioning in calculus, logarithm properties can be used to turn a difficult and tedious derivative problem into an easy one. And another logarithm property could be used to evaluate a difficult limit. So it gives them a little insight as to, again, they don't have to really know any details here. They're just getting a feel for, oh, okay, I see why I would want to learn this. Okay, I see that this has some relevance to something I'm going to be thinking about. And again, I italicized at the end here. So this statement would be written on the board, and then the teacher would lead the students through a discussion of this statement after completing number 6 in the class notes, which I'm not showing you right now. But so if there needs to be a discussion because the why statement isn't necessarily something they would understand, you might have a discussion about that as part of your lesson plan. But certainly you need to make sure the students understand why they should care about this lesson topic. Okay, next up, this box is a content-specific component. So this is going to vary from subject area to subject area. Again, this is the secondary math example. And so for math, you would have to explicitly describe how and where the lesson provides opportunities for students to develop conceptual understanding. So that's really getting at the heart of understanding the concept. Procedural fluency, which of course is more about the actual computations or solving or the algebra. Unfortunately, this is the thing that people think is all we have to teach, right? But that's of course not the point. We don't only want to teach procedure. We want to focus on the concept and then further also look at some math reasoning and or problem solving. Okay, and then further, you have to consider what representations will be used in this lesson to help students with these 3 areas. So this is math specific, and I don't want to go into it at this point. So I'm going to leave that for another time to talk about the content specific components. So those you will need to talk with your content specific pedagogy instructor. Okay, so moving on to academic language demands. This is a really, really important section for your EdTPA. Okay, it's going to be specifically addressed and assessed. I believe it's rubric number 4, at least for secondary math it is. So what you're going to have to do is identify what's called a language function. Okay, so what that means is you're identifying one language function essential for students to develop conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and math reasoning. And again, this is a math specific one. So let's look at the definition. So again, we go back to the glossary in our EdTPA handbook. And again, this is the math one, so you're going to want to look at the equivalent statement in your handbook. Okay, so language functions are the content and language focus of the learning task. It's represented by the action verbs within the learning outcome. So that's key right there, the active verbs within the learning outcomes. Common language functions in math include describing a math phenomena, predicting from modeling and data, models and data, comparing, summarizing, recording, justifying, etc. So, and again, you should look at your own handbook for examples. Some specific math verbs are non-examples of language functions because they focus on math action, not a language-based action. So examples of math functions that are not language functions include solve, if you're just having them solve a problem, or simplify an expression, or calculate an answer, or estimate an answer. That focus is all about the procedure, right? It's really focusing on a math action, not something language-based. If you are comparing two objects, you have to use math language in order to talk about them. If you're describing something, you have to, again, use math language, summarizing, recording, right? So all these language functions they're math specific. You're still talking about something math, and it's going to be really represented by the active verbs within the learning outcome. So let's look at an example. Okay, for the sample, the language function I chose was explain. And so that's going to be the same language function throughout the whole learning segment. So for all 3 to 5 lesson plans. So in the first one, you're really just listing that verb or that actual language function. And then in the second box after it, what you're going to do is list the key task within the lesson that allows students to practice the selected language function. So if you're expecting the students to be explaining something, you have to say where in the lesson plan they're going to have the opportunity to do that. So I list some places in within, so there's some class notes associated with this lesson plan that, again, you don't really need to see right now. The point is really to talk about that within the class notes, students are asked to explain why the domain of the common logarithm is positive real numbers. So they're asked to explain that. And then there's a couple other examples listed here. And then I always want to talk about how you're going to support that. So the teacher will support by emphasizing this concept when defining a logarithm on page 3 of the class notes. And then by connecting to exponential functions just studied. Okay, so if I'm asking the students to explain something, then you're going to want to talk about how you would support that. Here's another example. Again, the language function is still explain, and this gives a chance for students to explain why why one of the properties is just a generalization of another property. And then another place they're asked to extend one property for a product of 2 factors to 3 factors. And so it's asking the students to really understand the steps, or here explain the steps of a proof. So there's plenty of opportunities throughout the lessons where they're asked to explain. Okay, next up for academic language demands is usually the one that students find the easiest, which is identifying the vocabulary. And for mathematics, it would be and/or some symbols too. That would be required for the lesson plan. And then you want to state again how you would support the learning of the new vocabulary. So the way I want you to think about this section is if you're introducing some new vocabulary, some new terminology in your lesson plan, think about how you would do this if you were teaching a world language. If you're introducing someone to a new term, then you have to think about how you're going to support them. How are they going to understand that? How are they going to retain that word? Well, if you think about it in terms of a world language, I mean, the best way to do it is that you have to get the students using the word. You have to make sure they understand how to define the word. You have to make sure that they can hear the word or see the word used in a sentence or in several contexts even. In terms of mathematics, for the symbol, you have to make sure they understand what the symbol is and how the symbol is read out loud. Right, so for this example, the terminology or the vocabulary is logarithm or a common logarithm or the base of a logarithm. And then we have these symbols. And so obviously, if someone were just to be given this, they don't know to pronounce this log of x or log base b of x. They don't know how to do that. So you have to support the vocabulary and the symbols. So in this example, students were given written class notes, including the definitions. So certainly that would be, you have to provide the definitions. The symbols are written in the notes, including a statement in parentheses about how the symbols are read. Again, if you're introducing a new symbol for mathematics, you have to tell the students how to pronounce it. Another way of supporting the vocabulary words are written on a word wall bulletin board on the side of the classroom. So this would be something that you could have in your classroom and you could refer to it. So the students are seeing those new terms up on the board on a daily basis, and you can refer to them anytime throughout the unit that you are using them. It gives them the visual reminder of what the word is, and and you're pointing to it frequently. It helps the students learn that vocabulary. And then also the definition of a common logarithm is repeated within a question to reinforce the definition and help students connect the conceptual meaning of the common logarithm with its domain. So if you're going to, again, think about this with anytime you're learning some new word, if you can connect it to something you already know, so in other words, hear another word that has the same meaning, or in the sense from math, just connect the meaning to something they've already heard of, that's going to be a way to support that vocabulary. Let me give you another example of how I supported vocabulary. So this one actually had no new vocabulary in this lesson, and no new symbols, because this would be the second lesson right after the previous one. But even though there's no new vocabulary or syntax introduced in the lesson, students are still new to logarithms. So students are given written class notes. Again, that's a way of supporting it. They have it in writing. They have it with them to study from, with the definitions of the vocabulary terms. And the symbols are written in the notes. The vocabulary words are still on the word wall bulletin board, and those are referred to as needed throughout the lesson. Okay, so back to the language demands. We now have additional language demands that we have to consider and support. Okay, so at least one additional language demand over the course of the learning segment has to be addressed, and there has to be some support for it. So just to show you within the handbook that it's saying here that for additional language demands, so given the language function and the learning task you already identified, you have to also describe the following associated language demands students will need to understand. So the vocabulary and symbols we already talked about. For mathematics, there's math precision plus at least one of the following, either discourse or syntax. Okay, and as we've been saying in the lesson plan template, you're supporting each of these every time you list them. So in the template, I explicitly put a section for the language function, how you support the language function. Then there's vocabulary and support for the vocabulary. And then you need at least one more. And a math precision is an extra one for math. And so what does discourse and what does syntax mean? So yet again, we can go to the glossary of the handbook. Maybe you're starting to pick up on this here. This handbook is going to be very helpful. The handbook gives you explicit definitions in the glossary. So the vocabulary, I figured we didn't really need to talk about explicitly, but discourse includes the structures of written and oral language, as well as how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction. Discipline-specific discourse has distinctive features or ways of structuring oral or written language that provides useful ways for the content to be communicated. In mathematics, language structures include symbolic representations such as numbers, equations, two-column proofs, graphic representations, and a narrative. If the language function is to prove, for example, then appropriate language structures include formal two-column proofs as well as informal explanations that begin with the statement of the problem and known information, following by a series of statements such as, and then I know blank because blank, and ending with what is to be proved. So you want to think about discourse as really like the academic language. How do mathematicians or how do people in your content area, how do they talk? How do you make sure that you're not just using slang? Right? And this is going to be very difficult for students in general. Students want to say, give answers. When you ask a question like, how do you know this is true? And a student might say some very brief phrase of an answer, and they expect you to sort of fill in the gaps for them. And so really requiring your students to not just give quick yes or no answers and really having them talk and make sure they use the academic language, this is really going to be key to this EdTPA. You can't accept answers. And in fact, there's even part of your rubric when you actually go to implement your lesson plans for the EdTPA in the instruction task 2, there's a part where it gets at what kinds of questions you're asking the students and what kinds of answers you're allowing for. So if you're accepting answers, if you're asking yes or no questions and accepting yes or no answers, that's not going to score a passing score. You have to be giving opportunities for the students to use the academic language, and discourse is part of that. And again, you can read some of these other things. So for syntax, the set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into structures. So that would be another potential academic language demand that you could fill out. So what you're going to be looking for, and let me give you example here. So in fact, for lesson plan 1 in my learning segment, I actually don't have an additional language support, but I do have one in lessons 2, 3, and 4 of my of the learning segment. And so that's okay. You don't have to hit every single one of these every time, but over the course of the lesson plans, all 3 to 5 of them over the learning segment, you have to address them. So for my second lesson plan, I had discourse. So that was the additional language demand. So students are asked to work together to discover the properties of logarithms, which requires them to use academic language properly, excuse me. And so the way I supported that discourse is I gave them sentence starters, right? If I want them to actually have a conversation in a mathematical way, I gave them sentence starters. So they were given in this example, again, it's a math specific thing, but they were looking for some pattern to emerge, and it happened that the values were going up by 1. So I gave them sentence starters like, the pattern I noticed was blank, and this happened because blank. And so it's giving them, again, this structure for how to have this discourse. And then another support I gave was for another problem. Students were asked to, were also given structure to help them walk through the proofs of 2 properties. So again, it was something like, to get from one step of the proof to the other, this is why this is true. And there was like a blank for them to fill in. So this sentence starters can be one way to support discourse. And just to give one more example, this one's from my lesson 4 from the sample. I gave some support for discourse again, but also for math precision. Students were asked to use units in their solutions to the group scenarios, as well as at this checkpoint, again, in part of the lesson. So the way I supported that is that the teacher would be modeling using appropriate units throughout the course. So sometimes the support might just be that the teacher has demonstrated how to do this in the past. Okay, so hopefully you're still with me here. I know this is a very detailed video here, but we're back to the student background section of the lesson plan template. So this is where you want to be listing, so for prior knowledge, as it says here in the comment, you want to be thinking about upon what assessment data or previous lessons are you building? So how do you know what they already know? How do you know what the students know? And how does the content build on what the students already know and are able to do? So if you are teaching some lesson, then obviously students have to have some necessary background in order to be ready for this lesson plan. So this is where you would want to list that. And you might cite a pre-assessment or an assessment from a previous unit or something to justify how you know the students actually have this knowledge or skill coming into this unit. Okay, so you would want to be listing any prior knowledge or skill. You'd also list any prior academic language. So again, if there was any, like, for example, if you talk about the domain of a function of logarithms, for example, in this unit, then you better make sure they already know that vocabulary. They already know that word domain in some other context. So any language or vocabulary that you would expect them to know, any symbols that you would expect them to know, any other academic language. Now, the next component of the template is, again, very EdTPA specific. The EdTPA is wanting you to really connect the content to the students' personal, cultural, and or community assets. Okay, so as the comment says, what are your students' personal, cultural, community assets, and how do you connect the content of this learning segment / the lesson with these assets? Okay, so to give you an example, my sort of mock students, what I said was that the students in this class, and this is not a big stretch here, but they're particularly interested in technology, and like most high school students are active on various social media, right? So that's a pretty common sort of feature of a class that you could have, right? So many of them also work part-time and therefore have an appreciation of money. So you really want to be thinking about, like, what are my students interested in? Do they like sports? Do they work after school? If they do, what kind of jobs do they have? Do any of them work with a special type of population of students? Or are they interested in a certain video game? I mean, any of these sorts of personal connections you can make with the students. Or if it's more of like a community asset, like maybe football is a big thing that every Friday everyone goes to the football games, and you want to connect it somehow to that. But you want to think about what are the things that the students are really interested in. So again, for my example, My lesson starts with, in fact, let me pull it up. So the lesson starts with this visual here about Facebook and about that the number of registered users increased almost exponentially when it first launched. And it gives a graph here. And in fact, there's later in the lesson learning segment, we talk even about how Twitter and Pinterest, these other ones also sort of started exponentially. And then even sort of look at a model and a function that models this exponential growth. And so the point is, it's taking this concept of an exponential function and putting it in a context that's a little bit more interesting to the students, something that's more accessible to them. In another lesson later, just to give you more examples, we do an example where you're trying to buy an iPad and you have to save money for that. There's another sample where the students are trying to save up for a Jeep, and so if you might even have a student in your class who's saving up for a certain kind of car, and then you could make that kind of car the actual car that you use in your lessons. And then again, this one went back to that. This one was talking about Instagram. So again, making the problems something that the kids would be actually interested in. So when you complete this part of the lesson plan template, really think about this. And in fact, when we talk about the EdTPA in general, whenever I talk to people about it, I always recommend that you think about this before you even start planning out the content of the lesson plans, because right away you want to make sure that the problems you're choosing, the topics you're choosing, the examples you're choosing, whatever it is, that those are interesting and relevant to your students. So don't just pick random problems from a book or random excerpts of a book. I'm not as good at coming up with examples for non-math examples, but you want to be thinking about things that are going to be relevant to your students. Okay, moving on, the next portion of the lesson plan template is pretty self-explanatory. This would be any required lessons, lesson materials. So if you need handouts or a smartboard, or the students need calculators, or they need copies of a textbook, something like that would be listed there. And then any resources you use. So if you pulled any of your materials from an already created website, or the handouts were from something else, then you would want to list those resources there. And obviously, I can't stress the importance of making sure you don't plagiarize anything. So if you do use anything that's someone else's work, that you need to list that there. Okay, and here comes finally the meat of the lesson sequence. Okay, so in the setting column, this is when you're going to talk about, okay, is this lesson done in a whole class setting? Is it done individually? Is it done in pairs? Is it done in groups? How big are the groups? Okay. And then in the next column, you are listing how many minutes you are anticipating, you're estimating how long it takes. Obviously, when you're done, this column should add up to the total number of minutes of the class, which seems like a silly thing for me to actually say out loud, but I can't tell you how many lesson plans I've graded where that doesn't happen. So make sure you add those up and that they do sum to the total number of minutes in the class. Okay, now for the actual lesson plan, and there's actually a slight modification for math and maybe other subject areas where you might actually have a warm-up or something that's on the board before the lesson begins. So I have that there, but you may not need that. But where you really start the lesson is that hook or that launch or the initiation or whatever you want to call it. So really you want to think about, how will you get the lesson started? What questions or texts or inquiry modeling and or other techniques will you use to engage the students? How does this launch connect to the rest of the lesson? Okay, so just to give you an example, in this lesson plan, I have something on the board before the lesson begins. I have a warm-up on the board. So again, that might be a little bit more of a math-specific thing. So the hook or launch in this first lesson plan was that the teacher would ask, who uses Facebook? And of course expect that most of them would raise their hands. And then the teacher then asked the class when they think Facebook first launched. And it's unlikely they'll know the answer since this was 12 years ago. And now that would be a cute little way of just then now this teacher could project only the graph from page 1 of the class notes, and the teacher asked the class to look at the graph and use it to determine when Facebook launched. So they can use the graph, so you're reading the graph to find the answer. And then the teacher asks what kind of function is projected, and the students should know from the previous unit, because they would have just finished up an exponential unit, that it looks exponential. So it's a quick launch into the lesson. It gets them, and it's not something that's just sort of superficially there to be fun and catchy. Like, that's not the point. This is content specific. We're talking about Facebook, but we're talking about it in the context of what it's setting up for the content of the rest of the lesson. Okay, but it is interesting. It catches their eye. It makes students interested, hopefully. Okay, so that's the launch. And then for the rest of the this lesson component, you're going to continue to list the structure of the lesson, how many minutes you think it's going to have, and then what you're actually doing. So this should be broken up. Every time that you change the classroom setting, you should list a new number or a new part of the lesson so that you're breaking it up. And as it says in the comments, you want to explicitly include any formative assessments and label them as such within the lesson. So anytime you're doing either like an informal check, or maybe you're walking around and polling your students or having a conversation with your students, or it's your way of checking that the students are following along, you want to explicitly write that in your lesson plan, because as part of the EdTPA, you're going to have to talk about how you're assessing. So you want to be thinking about that as you're writing the actual lesson plan. So again, as an example here, the students are working on a certain part of the class notes. And the teacher's walking around to sort of facilitate discussions and informally check for understanding. So the fact that the teacher is informally checking for understanding, we have that formative assessment. Okay, so you fill out the lesson plan, and you'll notice I have several formative assessments throughout the lesson there. And then, of course, you end with your closure. So this is how you have students stop and reflect on the lesson. What did they just learn? Why is it important? How does it connect to prior or future learning? And as I explicitly write in the comment here, an exit ticket, which is a fan favorite. Everyone loves exit tickets, but they are a form of assessment, and alone they are not closure. It could be part of your closure. Maybe it's something you're having them turn in as they leave the room, but that's not sufficient on its own. The closure should really be the way you think about closure in terms of a relationship or something. It gives you this sort of warm, fuzzy feeling about how the lesson went. It's a way to make you feel like the lesson's complete. It's closure. So for an example here, the teacher is leading a discussion about what they just talked about, why they're important. Maybe the teacher is going to refer to a few specific parts of the class notes to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page. And then the teacher asks the students what they still need to learn, and expects the students to say that they only know how to evaluate logarithms with a certain base, so base 10. And so the teacher can then say, oh, well, in fact, that's what we're going to be talking about next time. So it's a way to sort of lead into the next topic. So closure should be a summarizing of the lesson. It doesn't have to be just the teacher standing at the front of the room saying, what we learned today, class, is blank. It doesn't have to be that, but there has to be some sort of summary. It could be that the teacher asks the students, what did you learn today? Can you summarize why this thing that we did today is important? I mean, there's certainly an infinite number of ways for you to close a lesson, but it shouldn't just be handing out an exit ticket and thinking you're done. Okay, we're getting there. We're almost done. So the next part is to anticipate any adjustments that you might need, so a backup plan. So that would be, I'll give you an example. There's some flexibility built into the lesson with an optional exercise for students who work quickly or need more of a challenge. If the lesson takes less time than anticipated, the class will play a Kahoot game. If the lesson takes more time than anticipated, then a certain part of the lesson could be omitted. And so knowing ahead of time before you start the lesson what you can either add to it or take away to make sure the timing works out well, that's something you want to have planned ahead of time. So that's what you want to be thinking about. So certainly anticipating adjustments should include what happens if the lesson's taking longer, or what happens if the lesson goes too quickly. Those are two things you certainly want to be thinking about. And then anything else you might be thinking about. Okay, assessment. This is probably a more typical thing that you would see in a lesson plan that most of you are more aware of. So really, what is assessment? So how will you know whether students are making progress towards your learning goals? So you should have already listed these formative assessments within the lesson above. Okay, but here you're just describing how you're going to know. And then there is a content-specific component to the lesson plan here. And so again, for math, that goes back to explain how your assessments provide evidence of these math things. And so for your content area, you again have to make sure you show that your assessment is assessing the content-specific pieces that your EdTPA requires. Okay, so as you can see, as you're writing these lesson plans, not only are you creating the lesson plan, but you're going to have to create any handouts or any class materials that go along with it, and also any assessments. And this is really all part of that first task one, the planning task one part of the EdTPA, is really where you're doing everything. You're creating everything and making sure that when you actually implement it, when you actually do this lesson and you assess the students, you're assessing them in all these areas, because assessment is part of task 3. But if you don't plan for it in task 1, you're not going to be able to do well in task 3. Okay, the last section is differentiation, and this is certainly something that you would be talking about in some of your other courses, and I'm not going to talk specifically about this, but this is where you would list all of the needs that your students have with IEPs or 504s. The EdTPA usually requires that you have an English language learner in there, so you may even have to, for the sake of like your capstone, you probably have to make up even if you don't have an English language learner that you're dealing with, you might just make up a student and like a mock English language learner, and then practice coming up with support for that student. You want to consider students needing challenge or enrichment, because certainly you don't want to only be accommodating for students who are struggling. You want to really think about how can you go above and beyond to support students who need a challenge, or maybe moving through the content a little quicker. How can you make sure they get a deeper understanding? There's another place in part of the EdTPA is really thinking about what are some common errors and misunderstandings. So you want to also address that in terms of the differentiation. So what it's sort of like anticipating what are the things the students are really likely to be confused about, and how do you make sure that you address those. And finally, as part of the template, we have a place where you can connect to research from theory, right? So, and this is again something that shows up in the EdTPA. See, in instruction task 2, there's an analyzing teaching effectiveness. So you need to demonstrate that you've made at least superficial connections to research and or theory. If you make not just superficial but real connections, then you can score a little higher. So that's why this is built into the lesson plan template, so that you have a place to be thinking about it. Again, as you're creating the lesson plans, be thinking about some of the principles, and you'll learn about some of these theories in your methods courses. Okay, and so one more comment about this lesson plan template in general, and this has to do with this watermark I have here, that there's a lot in this lesson plan, and most of it, well, I shouldn't say most of it, a lot of it is there so that when you go to actually answer the commentary, reply to the commentary prompts as part of the EdTPA, that you can explicitly draw from your lesson plans. So for example, the whole academic language piece, this is part of, again, the handbook. This is Planning Commentary Handbook. I'm scrolling down. Certainly there's more above this, but you have to use information about your students' language assets and needs to identify one language function essential for students to develop conceptual understanding. So we've already talked about this. So built right into the lesson plan is really 4A, that language function. So you're identifying it. Here's an example. Part B, identify the learning task from your plan that provides students with opportunities to practice this language function. Again, this is right from your lesson plan. So you're literally going to copy paste to answer these questions. The additional language demand, all of this. All of this is going to be literally just pulled right from your lesson plan, copy and pasted. So when you go to submit the lesson plan, in fact, you're not even going to include the academic language piece. You're going to just have the content focus section, and without even all of the content specific portions. You're going to skip right over to the student background. You'll have the materials, you'll have the lesson sequence, and you'll have the adjustments and assessment and differentiation, but then you won't even have the research. So several portions of the lesson plan template were really designed solely for helping you write the commentary of the EdTPA. And there is a page restriction, a page limit restriction on these lesson plans for when you actually submit them for the EdTPA. So you're going to want to delete all of the repetitive stuff. You don't need to list the academic language demands within the lesson plan. You're already going to be talking about that in the commentary. So you're going to delete all the parts that are not essential, and you're just going to include the parts that you need. Okay, and speaking of deleting, I already talked about this earlier, but you want to make sure that when you submit your lesson plans, that you don't want all these comments here, right? So what you have to make sure you do is go to your review, and for some reason something's not working here. Let's see. Yeah, go to your review, and under comments, you're just going to delete all comments in the document. Okay, and then that way when you save it, those comments are gone, and you're not going to accidentally submit in the EdTPA something that has prompts on the side. So that would be a little bit embarrassing. So make sure you delete those comments before you submit it. Those comments are really just there as a reminder to help you understand how to use the template. But hopefully this video helped you, and now you hopefully understand the basics of how to use this lesson plan template. And good luck.